Okay, thank you, Mark. First of all, I want to just say to those assembled, first of all, many of you are board members, so you're going to hear some of the same things that we'll discuss tomorrow in the board meeting. But I also just wanted a personal observation that one of the really compelling reasons for ILSI North America is that you see the opportunity to have scientific research done by outstanding scientists, and you have an organization that supports that. But the other reason that you support ILSI North America, hopefully, is because it looks beyond those specific topics and looks at the entire field of scientific research. And what is it, how is it that that research should be done in the most ethical way, bringing the most relevant scientific principles to bear on conducting that research. And that's a really, really important thing to be doing. And I congratulate especially our industrial members for bringing forth the wherewithal, meaning money, that allows ILSI staff and volunteers to assist in making sure that we have good science on which to base good food policies. Well, you may recall that we've had several activities going on relative to the conflict of interest. We were very successful in establishing a set of principles, getting those published in peer-reviewed publications. And we've also had some great success by staff assisting in leading the public-private partnership. And you recall that last June 15 of 2015, there was a consortium forum, more or less, of a variety of partners, including AAAS, including USDA agencies, and including the scientific societies, to put into play that list of principles for forming public-private partnerships, what they ought to look like, what they ought to be like, how they ought to be open. And so there was, coming out of that, a very successful event, and then our thinking turned also to conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is not going away, but we did decide to focus a little more on the entire issue of scientific integrity. And so we reformulated the Conflict of Interest Task Force into the Scientific Integrity Task Force. And that was done this last year. We have two wonderful staff persons, Allison and Delia, who are working to help make this project go forward. So I'd like to share with you now a little bit of information with regard to where we are going on moving the Scientific Integrity Task Force and its work forward. So first of all, it was Todd Abram, I think, who brought up the issue of with regard to thinking about this as a sport, using the sports analogy. There are rules of the game, scientific rules that we ought to be following. There are ways to interpret those rules of the game. There's the guy up in the booth who makes the interpretation. There are ways to draw conclusions about what happened, what we saw, etc. Those are the analysts who help us figure out, okay, what just happened and how did that guy make that tremendous catch, etc. And so we've used this sports analogy a little bit, and I'll come back to that in just a moment when we talk about a follow-up idea on that. But these rules of the game have to be delineated. And are they delineated? Are they somewhere? And we began to ask the question about that. And so there was an initiative to find out, with regard to scientific integrity, are there rules of the game? Where are we with regard to our scientific societies, our government agencies, and NGOs, etc., relative to defining those rules of the game, relative to scientific research? And what we found was that, yes, indeed, there are rules of the game being worked on. And in fact, they're being worked on in so many areas, including on here, the federal agencies, foundations, nonprofit organizations, professional societies, etc., that and academia itself, that in fact it's a hodgepodge. And so the Scientific Integrity Task Force Working Group asked the staff to pull together all of the information with regard to what these agencies and these organizations are working on relative to scientific integrity. And the staff, our staff, have done an absolutely masterful job. They generated a manuscript, which is now being considered in the critical reviews in food and nutrition. And that manuscript is now under review under Ferg's editor-in-chiefship of that journal, and will ultimately result in trying to pull together what we now know is going on in the area of scientific integrity. Now, coming out of that will be another journal, a paper that will generate information on the principles that can be pulled out of all of this activity that's going on relative to how to successfully do scientific research so that there is no ambiguity. And so taking into account the experimental, well, first of all, taking into account hypothesis generation. It's absolutely incredible today how little we see in research papers that there was a hypothesis. It seems like everybody just jumps in and starts doing research. And they don't actually sit down ahead of time and say, well, what is the question that we're trying to answer? That's a political statement. And so we have the same issue. What is our hypothesis? How do we design our experiments to address the hypothesis? How do we generate the data? What kind of methodology are we using? How do we then interpret those data? And finally, how do we make sure that the conclusions we draw are those that we can draw? And we haven't overextended our analysis of the data and drawn conclusions that are not appropriate to the data that we've generated against the hypothesis that we are testing. And so that manuscript is beginning to be worked on. We will pull together principles from all of this activity that's going on out there. But in order to do that, we need again to bring together a coalition, AAAS. We need APLU, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. We need professional societies. We need nonprofit organizations. We need governmental organizations, regulatory bodies, etc., to have input into that. All of those, including NIH in spades, is looking at scientific integrity. So we need to bring that coalition together again to help to develop these principles. We need to have a process to adopt those principles. We're looking forward to possibly a meeting next June or next summer as a result of bringing together those principles and see if we can't get some buy-in in a much broader way with these various agencies and various entities that ought to have an interest in these. So that's the work of the group. The other activity I said that came out of this, and it's sort of in line with the sports analogy, and that is that we could see if we could formulate a tournament that would identify some, or at least a small number, of the very best papers relative to those elements I mentioned: hypothesis generation, methodology, statistics, the interpretation of data, the drawing of conclusions, etc. And not that there aren't a whole large number of those papers out there, but is there a really good example that could be held up and say, this is what a successful research endeavor looks like? And so we're working on that, and we think that you'll be excited to that. We'll hope to obviously get sponsorship for that. We'll hope we'll get many of these organizations to buy into that. So with that, that's what's happening with scientific integrity, and we've got a great working group on it, but we've got a great staff to support that effort. Thank you.